Welcome back to the deep dive. Um, we have a pretty massive stack of documents on the table today, and I mean uh, truly massive.
Right, yeah.
But we are primarily focusing on a singular source today, a primary source that honestly arguably redefines the entire genre of the political memoir. We are peeling back the layers of the book 107 Days by Kamala Harris.
Right, and calling it a memoir almost feels like a misnomer, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does.
Because it's not one of those soft focus autobiographies, the ones where we spend 3 chapters on a childhood lemonade stand or something.
Absolutely. None of that here.
This is a tactical after-action report. It covers a very specific, a very intense window of time, literally from the disastrous June debate to the November election, exactly 107 days.
Exactly. And the mission for this deep dive, for you listening at home, is to really look under the hood of that political machine.
Right.
We aren't here to litigate the politics. We aren't here to argue about the policies of the 2024 election, or who should have won or who should have lost.
No, not at all.
We are here to understand the actual mechanics of a sudden and honestly almost violent power transfer. We want to know what happens logically, emotionally, structurally when you have to dismantle a sitting president's campaign and just rebuild a new one in essentially 48 hours.
Which is wild. We're looking for the friction points here. Like, how do you actually merge 2 rival staffs who have completely different workplace cultures?
Right.
How do you lock down delegates before a convention when, frankly, everyone smells blood in the water? What physically happens logistically when that secure phone rings?
It's the how, not just the what.
Mhm.
And before we jump in, the standard disclaimer definitely applies here. We're analyzing this narrative strictly as it is presented in the source text.
Exactly.
We're unpacking the author's account of these events so we can understand her perspective on the logistics and the strategy. We aren't taking political sides. We're just reading the map she drew for us.
And it is such a fascinating map because it starts in a place of total isolation. Let's look at the first section from the text, the catalyst, the debate on June 27th.
The setting she describes here is so crucial because it really highlights the strange isolation of being the vice president. You'd think, big night, huge debate, she's right there in the mix.
Right, in the spin room.
Exactly. But she wasn't. The text points out that Harris wasn't in the spin room in Atlanta. She wasn't backstage with the president. She was in Los Angeles, at the Fairmont Hotel, in a conference room that she specifically describes as overchilled.
That detail about the temperature, it comes up a few times, actually. It really sets this sterile, uncomfortable tone. And she's there with her Praetorian Guard, Sheila Nix, who is her chief of staff, Brian Felon, a senior advisor, and Kirsten Allen, her comms director.
Her core people.
Right. These are her loyalists, the people who, and I think this is super important context, they aren't necessarily part of the Biden inner circle. They are her team.
Yeah, and the book describes this fascinating disconnect that happens almost immediately once the debate starts. They're sitting in this cold room, watching the feed, seeing the exact same thing you and I and everyone else saw.
The stiff gait.
The stiff gait, the thready voice. But while they are watching this happen on screen, their phones are blowing up with a completely different reality.
This is the first major friction point the book highlights. The bubble versus the world. Harris describes watching the screen and just seeing a man who looked unwell.
Yeah.
She mentions his gait specifically in the text, noting that he had refused to wear the medical boot for his foot fracture, which is what made him look so stiff walking out, but then he actually starts speaking.
And the text messages just start rolling in. She lists some of them in the book. Disaster, train wreck, what is happening?
Yeah.
And these are coming from major donors, from allies, from people in the trenches of the party. But meanwhile, on the screen, the official campaign surrogates are already out there trying to spin it as a win.
And she pinpoints the exact moment the bubble burst for her personally. It wasn't just the visuals, it was the content. She notes the moment Biden confused millions with billions.
Oof.
And then, of course, the infamous line, "We finally beat Medicare."
That line, man. I think the whole country just collectively paused at that moment.
Harris writes about seeing no light in his eyes during that moment, which is just a haunting phrase. It suggests this cognitive vacancy that terrified her, not just as his running mate, but as his subordinate.
Right.
She describes having this gnawing feeling in her stomach. She actually references a phone call she had with him a few days prior where he sounded exhausted, but she notes that what was happening on the stage was entirely different.
And this leads right into what I think is the first real lesson in crisis management in the entire book, We can call it the talking points incident.
Oh, this part is incredible.
It's a commercial break. The debate is over, the absolute panic is setting in across the party, and Harris has to go on live television with Anderson Cooper in a matter of minutes.
The pressure in that freezing little room must have been immense. Brian Felon, her advisor, slides her a piece of paper. It's the official campaign talking points that just came down from headquarters, a headquarters that is still being devastatingly optimistic.
And what does the paper say?
In bold, all caps, Joe Biden won.
Which, let's be honest, is pure gaslighting.
It is, but it's also standard political operating procedure. Deny, deny, deny. Because the logic is if you admit defeat, you completely lose the narrative. But Harris's reaction here, this is the pivot point for her entire trajectory in the book.
Yeah.
She looks at the paper, then she looks at Felon, and she says, and I quote from the text, "Don't feed me bullshit."
I just love that moment so much. It completely cuts through the noise.
And she references that old Richard Pryor joke in the room. Who are you going to believe, me or your lion eyes?
Right.
It's a funny line, but it's also a profound strategic insight. She realized right then that the American public isn't stupid. They saw what they saw.
But you have to remember, this is a massive high-stakes strategic gamble for her. If she goes out there on CNN and just repeats the Joe Biden one line like a robot, she destroys her own credibility with the public forever. She just becomes a political hack.
Exactly.
But on the flip side, if she agrees that he failed, she betrays the president. She looks disloyal. It is a complete lose-lose scenario.
So she executes what we call a bridge strategy. She goes on CNN, and she absolutely refuses to validate the debate performance itself. She acknowledges it was a slow start, which, diplomatic understatement of the century.
Truly.
But she immediately pivots to the time frame. Her line was, "I'm not going to talk about the last 90 minutes. I'm going to talk about the last 3.5 years.
The temporal pivot. You just shift the data set entirely. You move the listener's brain away from the immediate disaster and point them toward the historical record.
Precisely. It's a way to defend the administration without defending the actual debate performance. But the book shows that even then, she was unsure if it landed. There's this great little detail where right after the interview ends, she slides a note card under the camera frame to her team.
Yeah, and it just says, feedback.
Right. She needed a reality check in real time. She was flying completely blind out there. And her team wrote back, "Keep saying 3.5 years versus 90 minutes.
And it worked. Even John King on CNN mentioned that night that she had been kept under wraps by the administration, and that this interview was a moment where she finally showed her capabilities.
Yeah.
But the memoir makes it very clear. She survived the night, but the damage was structural. The foundation of the campaign had cracked.
Which brings us to the waiting game. Those agonizing weeks between the debate and the actual dropout. Let's fast forward to the moment the dam actually breaks. Section 2 from the text. The call. Sunday, July 21st.
The setting here is just almost comically normal compared to the stakes of what's about to happen. It's a Sunday morning. She's at the Naval Observatory. She's not in a war room. She isn't wearing a suit.
No, the book says she's wearing sweatpants and an old Howard University sweatshirt. She's in the kitchen making pancakes with her grandnieces, Amara and Leela. They're doing a jigsaw puzzle on the dining room table.
It's so mundane.
It really is the calmest scene in the entire book.
It creates such a sharp contrast for the reader. You have this domestic tranquility, and outside those walls, the entire Democratic Party is just melting down on cable news. And then at 1:11 p.m. exactly, the secure phone rings.
No, she notes that the caller ID was blocked, and she stops what she's doing immediately. She writes that she knew instantly who it was, because only a tiny handful of people have that direct line to her, and only one comes up blocked.
It's the president.
It is Joe Biden. He's over in Rehoboth Beach, isolating because he had COVID. She describes his voice on the phone as hoarse and exhausted, and he cuts right to the chase. He tells her he's out.
Can you even imagine that moment? For you listening, just put yourself in those sweatpants for a second. You're holding a spatula, looking at a jigsaw puzzle, and the President of the United States calls to tell you his political career is over.
It's staggering.
She asks him, "Are you sure?" And his reasoning in the text is really interesting. He says, "It's the only thing anyone is talking about. It's too much."
He was facing a full-scale mutiny. He finally realized the bleeding just wouldn't stop. But here is where we get into the real mechanics of the power transfer, the stuff that is usually totally hidden from the public. Because there was an immediate conflict on that phone call, a disagreement that honestly could have tanked her candidacy before it even started.
Yes, the endorsement gap. I found this part so fascinating.
This is critical for you to understand if you want to know how politics actually works. Biden, along with his top aides, Steve Ricchetti and Mike Donilon, had a very specific plan. They wanted to issue a public statement that Biden was stepping down, and then maybe a day or two later, they would issue a separate statement endorsing Harris.
Now, to a layperson, that actually sounds incredibly respectful.
Yeah.
You let the president have his moment, let him say goodbye to the country, let the news cycle digest this historic moment, and then a day later you talk about the successor. It seems like the decent, normal thing to do.
But in political mechanics, it's a death sentence. And Harris recognized this instantly. She writes that her blood ran cold when they suggested it, because if Biden steps down without immediately pointing to his successor, he creates a massive power vacuum.
A vacuum that just invites total chaos.
Exactly. Because the media cycle runs 24/7. If there is a 24-hour gap between his dropout and his endorsement, the entire narrative on every network becomes, why didn't he endorse her? Does he not trust his own VP? Who else is running? Is she not ready?
Oh, absolutely.
It basically invites challengers, people like Gavin Newsom, Gretchen Whitmer, Josh Shapiro. It gives them an opening to jump in. It effectively starts an open, contested convention right there on Sunday afternoon.
So she pushed back on the president.
She pushed back hard. She told him, Joe, there can be no daylight. She argued that a gap would be completely ruinous, that it would look like hesitation, it would look like weakness to the voters and the donors. And to his credit, Ricchetti conceded the point right there on the call. They agreed to couple the announcement and the endorsement together.
That one decision likely saved the party from an absolute civil war. If she'd been left hanging out to dry for 48 hours, we might be analyzing a very different election outcome right now.
Absolutely. The momentum would have shifted entirely to who's next instead of she's next.
Now, while this incredibly tense phone call is happening, there's this wild subplot happening simultaneously involving Tony West, her brother-in-law, this red file situation. It sounds like something out of a Tom Clancy novel, but it's actually just responsible governance, isn't it?
It is. So Tony West is a former high-ranking Department of Justice official. And a year prior to this, he realized that running an 81-year-old incumbent meant you had to legally plan for, well, incapacitation or worse.
Right.
It's grim to think about, but it's necessary. The red file was their break glass protocol.
What exactly was that?
It detailed the precise first 24 to 48 hours of a sudden transition of power. Literally, who do you call in the first hour? What are the constitutional transfer mechanisms? What are the FEC legal requirements for transferring hundreds of millions in campaign funds from a presidential ticket to the VP? It was a literal roadmap for a sudden disaster.
And the irony here is just unbelievable. The book notes that Tony West was physically at the Naval Observatory, out in the pool house, holding a tabletop exercise on this exact hypothetical scenario at the exact moment Harris was taking the real phone call in the main house.
It's almost literary. He was discussing the theoretical crisis while she was living the actual crisis, and when she hung up, she called him into the main house. The book says he just looked at her. They just stared at each other for a second, and Tony said, if this isn't handled right, he will crap all over his legacy.
Those are the stakes. It wasn't just about her winning the nomination. It was about preventing a total institutional collapse. So the clock officially starts. That brings us to Section 3, the scramble. We are now in what they call the boiler room phase.
Right. So that domestic tranquility is over. The Naval Observatory dining room is instantly transformed. The puzzle is gone. The grandniece's pancakes are cleared away. It's suddenly just covered in binders, laptops, and anchovy pizza.
Anchovy pizza?
Yeah, apparently that's her comfort food.
Wow.
It's a very specific detail she includes. But obviously the menu is far less important than the strategy they were cooking up. And the strategy was no coronation.
Explain that for the listener.
Yeah.
Because she's the sitting vice president. She now has the official endorsement of the president. Why isn't it just a coronation?
Because legally, the delegates, the actual human beings who vote at the Democratic National Convention, were pledged to Joe Biden, not Kamala Harris. When Biden dropped out, those 4,000 plus delegates instantly became uncommitted free agents. Technically, they could vote for anyone they wanted.
So it really was a free-for-all on paper.
Theoretically, yes. And powerful people within the party, folks like Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama, were actually advocating behind the scenes for a mini primary, a condensed competition to thoroughly vet the candidates. They wanted town halls, quick debates, A blitz primary?
They wanted an open process to ensure whoever the nominee was,
Yeah.
they were actually battle-tested. They didn't want to just hand the keys to her and hope for the best.
Correct. Their genuine worry was that if she was just anointed by the establishment, she would be seen as weak by the voters. But Harris's team knew the math. They knew that a mini primary in late August would burn hundreds of millions of dollars, create vicious infighting, and leave whoever won totally bloodied right before the general election.
Right.
They had to completely bypass this mini primary idea, and the only way to do that was by locking down the delegates so fast that her nomination became a total fait accompli.
So how do you stop a mini primary from happening without looking like you're aggressively stopping it?
You overwhelm the system with speed. This leads to what the book calls the 100 calls. She literally sat at that dining room table for hours, just rolling calls to party elites, labor leaders, and key delegates.
It's a masterclass in whipping votes. The list she provides is just a who's who of the Democratic Party. And the reactions she records from these calls are so telling about where the power really lies.
They really are. Like, the Clintons were on board immediately. Bill Clinton told her, "Send me anywhere." Hillary Clinton wanted to be part of the actual war council. They understand the mechanics of party loyalty and falling in line better than anyone.
But the call with the Obamas was a bit cooler, wasn't it?
Yes, Barack Obama was supportive on a personal level. He told her to saddle up, which is a nice, encouraging voice. But he explicitly stated, "Michelle and I are not going to put a finger on the scale right now."
So you refused to endorse her right away.
No, he didn't. He wanted to protect the democratic process.
Yeah.
He wanted to let Joe Biden have his moment in the news cycle, and he really didn't want to look like the party puppet master pulling the strings. It wasn't meant as an insult to Harris, but it was a massive hurdle. It meant she didn't have the full unified weight of the party behind her yet.
And then, of course, there's the Gavin Newsom call.
Oh, man, the hiking incident. This is perhaps the shadiest single moment in the entire memoir.
Set the scene for us.
Okay, so Harris calls Newsom. Keep in mind, they are longtime rivals. They both came up through California politics. He's widely considered a top potential challenger for the nomination, so he picks up the phone. She tells him exactly what's happening with Biden, and Newsom just says, "Hiking. We'll call back."
Yeah.
And the memoir just notes so dryly, he never did.
He never called back. That is just dripping with subtext.
It's huge. Newsom was clearly keeping his powder dry. He was waiting. If he sensed any weakness from her in that next 24 hours, if she stumbled on a statement, if the mega donors balked at funding her, he might have jumped into the race. By explicitly not calling back, he was holding his option to run against her. He was waiting to see which way the wind blew.
That is the absolute ruthlessness of politics we were talking about. But the wind ended up blowing very hard for Harris, mostly because of the fundraising, which takes us perfectly to Section 4. The takeover, it's now Monday, July 22nd. She flies to Wilmington, Delaware.
To the Biden-Harris headquarters, or as she brilliantly calls it in the book, the Joe-shaped organism.
I love that phrase, Joe-shaped organism. What exactly does she mean by that?
She means the entire infrastructure of the building, the staff, the workflows, the internal culture. It was all custom built around Joe Biden's specific personality and his specific needs. You cannot just swap the CEO of a company overnight and expect the company to run the exact same way.
Right, and she describes walking into the building, and the staff were literally crying at their desks.
They were grieving. They truly loved Joe Biden. Many of them had worked for him for decades. They felt like they had personally failed him by letting the poll numbers slip. But Harris walks in, and she writes that the atmosphere slowly shifted from tears to cheers. They had taken these makeshift Harris for president signs and just taped them over the old Biden-Harris signs.
It sounds so incredibly makeshift.
It was. But she brought what her team called proof of life. $81 million raised in 24 hours.
That is just an unfathomable amount of money. And that money ended the mini primary argument instantly, didn't it?
Completely. You cannot primary a candidate who just raised $81 million from grassroots donors in a single day. It froze the entire field. It told Newsom, it told Whitmer, it told the Obamas, the train has left the station, get on board.
But even with the money, inside the actual building, there was friction. We have to talk about the tennis hut. This was easily my favorite detail in the book, because the tennis hut isn't a physical place in this context, it's a culture.
Right. It refers to a literal pavilion at the White House, sure, but in the memoir, it's used as a metaphor for the Biden inner circle's specific style of briefing the president. Harris describes these briefings as dog and pony shows.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning they were heavily filtering the data. They were only showing the president the good coals. They were systematically downplaying the risks in the swing states. They were managing his mood rather than managing the harsh reality of a failing campaign.
And Harris hated it.
She despised it. She demanded raw data from day one. She writes that she sat the pollsters down and told them, "Don't feed me bullshit." There's that phrase again. It's her mantra. She didn't want the sugar-coated version of the electoral map. She wanted to know exactly how bad the numbers really were so her team could actually fix them.
This highlights such a key difference in leadership styles. And it inevitably led to a massive personnel shift.
It did. She started bringing in her own people. David Plouffe, who was the brilliant architect behind Obama's 2008 win, came in as a senior strategist. Plouffe is legendary for being cold, mathematical, and completely unsentimental about politics. But notably, she kept Jen O'Malley-Dillon as the campaign chair.
Why keep the old boss if you're trying to change the culture?
Because you can't build a totally new airplane while you're already flying it. Jen O'Malley-Dillon knew where all the bodies were buried in that headquarters. She knew the complex logistics of field offices and ad buys. Harris desperately needed the machinery to keep running, but she needed to change the software running it, the strategy and the information diet.
Okay, so she has the machine running, she has the money in the bank, now she desperately needs a message. Section 5 of the text, defining the candidate. She had to completely reintroduce herself to the American public in a matter of days.
And remember, she didn't have time for the usual focus groups. Usually a presidential campaign spends months and millions of dollars testing slogans. She had to go on pure instinct, so she went back to her roots.
The prosecutor versus felon frame.
It was the path of least resistance. It was just sitting right there waiting for her. Trump had recently been convicted of 34 felony counts in New York. Harris had spent her entire early career as a prosecutor in California. The contrast literally wrote itself.
In her very first speech to the campaign staff in Wilmington, she laid it out. She didn't bog them down with policy papers or 10-point plans. She just talked about her resume.
She listed the exact types of people she used to prosecute. Predators who abused women, fraudsters who ripped off consumers, cheaters who broke the rules for their own gain. And then she delivers the absolute kill shot line of the speech. "I know Donald Trump's type."
That line landed so hard, it reframed the entire election instantly. It wasn't old versus crazy anymore, which is what the Biden-Trump matchup felt like to a lot of voters. It was suddenly law versus disorder.
Exactly. It took her past as a cop, which, let's remember, some progressives had heavily criticized her for in 2020, and it turned it into her greatest possible weapon. It normalized her record for moderates, but she also needed a forward-looking message to pair with it, and that's where "We're not going back" came from.
That happened at a rally in West Allis, right? Wisconsin.
Yeah, yes. And the book claims it wasn't even a planned campaign slogan. She was just using the phrase in a speech to draw a contrast with the, again, part of Make America Great Again. She's essentially saying, he wants to take us back to the past. We want to move into the future. But the crowd just latched onto it spontaneously.
They started chanting it, "We're not going back."
It became the defining rallying cry almost by accident because it perfectly captured the underlying anxiety of the Democratic electorate, specifically their fears about abortion rights being rolled back and democratic norms degrading. It was totally organic.
And speaking of organic, we have to talk about the digital pivot, the whole Brat summer phenomenon.
Oh man, the Brat moment. This is something the Biden campaign could never, ever have pulled off in a million years.
For any listeners who might have somehow missed this bizarre cultural blip, Charlie XCX, who is a British pop star, tweeted 3 simple words: "Kamala is Brat."
Now, if you work in traditional politics, being called a brat is bad, right? You would immediately issue a press release denying it. But in Gen Z internet culture, thanks to Charlie's massive hit album, being brat meant being messy, authentic, confident, maybe a little chaotic. It was actually a high compliment.
And instead of being confused by it, the campaign just fully embraced it.
They changed their official Twitter background to that specific ugly lime green color from the album cover. They launched a massive TikTok team led entirely by Gen Z staffers. The book says Harris basically gave them a few simple rules and then just let them trick it out.
That is a huge risk for a presidential campaign, giving the keys to the brand over to 25-year-olds.
It really is. But it was a necessary acknowledgement that the candidate was fundamentally different now. Biden had been very reluctant to use TikTok because of security concerns. Harris just embraced the meme culture head on. It signaled energy. It signaled a generational shift. It told young voters, we speak your language, we get the joke.
It's amazing how quickly that happened. It redefined her public image from this kind of stiff, awkward VP to a pop culture icon in about 48 hours. But I want to pivot away from the digital stuff to the personal side of this story. We touched on Doug Emhoff earlier, but the book goes into a lot of detail about the unique challenges of being the second gentleman.
It's a role with absolutely no historical blueprint. Harris mentions in the book that she literally made up the title Second Gentleman on the fly during a CNN interview years ago because nobody knew what else to call him. But the official infrastructure just wasn't there for a man in that position.
There's that chart she mentions in the text.
Yes, she found a literal White House organizational chart where family life was just used as a euphemism for a housekeeper. There was no dedicated support staff for a male spouse, no one to handle his daily schedule or his policy initiatives initially.
She talks about doing his laundry.
And cooking and freezing meals for him, it's such a grounding, relatable detail. Here is the Vice President of the United States dealing with global crises and a collapsing campaign, and she's spending her Sunday freezing casserole so her husband has something to eat while she's traveling. It really humanizes the chaos of their lives.
But Doug really leaned into the role eventually. He didn't just stay quietly in the background.
He became a major strategic asset for her. He focused heavily on the post-Dobbs hellscape, which is the term he used. He became a very vocal advocate for reproductive rights from a distinctly male perspective, which was entirely unique in politics. He went out there and argued that abortion bans affect men and families, too, not just women.
And he's fiercely protective of her. There's that incredible story in the book about him physically removing a protester who rushed to stage. She calls him her Jersey boy.
It really adds a compelling layer of partnership to the narrative. But honestly, the most complex relationship explored in the book isn't with Doug. It's with Joe Biden.
Section 6 really dives deep into this dynamic. We see the real warmth between them, the weekly lunches, the deep loyalty she felt. But we also see the underlying tension.
It's undeniable tension. Harris describes this pervasive, keep her under wraps narrative that plagued her entire vice presidency. She felt utilized by the administration for tough assignments, but also purposefully hidden away. And the Tenetset data filtering we talked about earlier, that was a source of massive ongoing frustration for her. She felt the campaign was intentionally keeping her in the dark about how bad his polling really was.
And there's also that lingering moment with Jill Biden. The tension from the 2019 primary debates, where Harris famously attacked Joe on his busing record, apparently never fully went away. The book mentions a distinct change of temperature from Jill after the 2020 election was won. And then suddenly, there's this unexpected 4th of July invite to the White House in 2024. It felt strained, like a forced peace offering right before the storm hit.
Yeah, but the absolute most poignant part of this entire dynamic is the farewell phase. After he officially drops out, Harris makes sure to praise him effusively in every single stump speech. She calls him a historically transformative president. She really leans on his legislative legacy. But then her new campaign strategist, David Plouffe, sits her down for a meeting.
And he just gives her the cold, hard, brutal political truth.
He tells her she has to stop talking about him entirely.
That is just brutal to read.
He says, "People hate Joe Biden." Those are the exact words written in the text. Not people dislike him or people are tired of him. Hate. Plouffe's point was that the electorate was absolutely furious about inflation. They were mad about the border. They were mad about the general vibe of the country. If she kept tying herself to him in her speeches, she would inherit all of his baggage, specifically his historically low approval ratings. She had to completely cut the cord to survive politically.
It's such a tragic element of the story. It really highlights the sheer fragility of a political legacy. One day you are the President of the United States seeking re-election, and the very next day your own VP is being told by consultants to stop mentioning your name out loud because you've become a liability.
But that's the nature of the game at that level. Plouffe wasn't being malicious. He was just being mathematical. And Harris listened to him. She shifted her stump speech overnight. She stopped starting her sentences with Joe and I, and she started saying I.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's just look at the summary of these 107 days. It starts in the absolute depths of a failing campaign, total post-debate depression, and it ends with an $81 million relaunch in just 24 hours.
It is a masterclass study in crisis management, but for me, the lingering image from the book is the joyful warrior photo she describes right at the end.
Describe that scene for the listener.
It's 10 p.m. on that fateful Sunday. They are still in the boiler room at the Naval Observatory. They've made the 100 calls. They've successfully locked down the delegates. They've eaten all the anchovy pizza. And there are 17 rumpled, exhausted people in this dining room, and they stop to take a group photo.
And it's not a polished press photo at all.
No, she says it's blurry. The lighting is terrible. Everyone looks like they haven't slept in a week. But they're all smiling. It perfectly captures that quiet moment right before they head into the battle of their lives.
It's a great reminder that behind all the polished podiums and the slick TV ads, it's really just people in a room, eating bad food, frantically trying to figure out what to do next.
And I think that's the real takeaway for the listener here. We tend to think of history as this grand, inevitable march of big events. But so often, it's actually decided by a few frantic phone calls, a few rapid pivots in a cold conference room, and someone's willingness to just say, "I'm ready."
And their willingness to answer a blocked phone number on a Sunday morning while making pancakes.
Exactly.
So here's a provocative thought to leave you with as you go about your day. We spent a lot of time today talking about the mechanics of this takeover, but really think about the terrifying fragility of it all. If Tony West hadn't started that red file a year early, if Harris hadn't insisted on closing that endorsement gap on the phone call, if she just accepted the bad data from the tennis hut without pushing back.
The entire timeline changes. You get an open convention in Chicago, a completely different nominee, a totally different general election.
It really makes you wonder how many other massive moments in American history hinged on someone deciding to skip a mini primary or someone holding a tabletop exercise at the exact right moment.
It's the butterfly effect, but inside the Oval Office.
Truly. Well, thank you for diving deep with us today. This was an incredible look inside the room where it all happened, courtesy of the source text, 107 Days.
Thanks for listening.
See you next time.